Thank you for meeting with us, Catherine. We wanted to ask you a few questions about OER Africa's work, and I wanted to begin by asking you, what is the mission of OER Africa?
Well, OER Africa was set up to work with African institutions of higher education, and we had this idea that there was a gap in curriculum, there was a gap in the entire system which had been severely underfunded for years for a variety of reasons. The higher education system across the continent is also trying to deal with challenges of ever-increasing classroom numbers and a faculty that in many cases is aging and simply cannot cope with the numbers of students. By now, Kathleen, you'll have had the opportunity to sit in a lecture in an African higher education institution. You can see that classrooms that were once built to accommodate 20 students, maybe 25, are now having to accommodate 250 students. Some of them can't hear what's going on. So effectively, you have distance education going on in a face-to-face mode, which was never the intention. When we started talking with higher education practitioners, it was not as though they hadn't noticed that there was a gap, but there is a gap in resources. And we felt that if people were introduced to the concept of open educational resources, and far more importantly, the underlying concept of sharing resources, of sharing knowledge, that they might start to find ways of tackling this problem. So, for example, and I know this is a very long-winded answer to your question, we're working with a few institutions in Ghana, 2 institutions in Ghana, 2 institutions in South Africa. And these 4 institutions have together noted particular gaps in their health curriculum. And they thought that if they worked together, they could fill those curriculum gaps. And they would be able to share those resources, the educational resources that they created to fill those gaps. They could also deliver them, they could also create them collaboratively, because to create resources on my own is going to cost far more time and far more money than if I was to do it with someone else. So this whole idea of collaborating was very appealing to these institutions. So this was the idea really behind OER Africa. If we could bring together like-minded individuals who realized that there was a gap and there was a possibility of filling that gap in the educational system and making sure that teaching and learning was constantly being improved, that curriculum was constantly being improved, then maybe we would be one small step towards solving one of the problems in higher education systems in Africa.
You touched on this a little in your last answer, but what is OER Africa's vision for higher education in Africa?
What a higher education system is doing is equipping people with the skills to provide leadership in the future. They are providing the intellectual capital of a nation. So we pay taxes, we fund the education system, and we hope that one day the people who come out of there will be better equipped than we ourselves are to take the country or to take the continent to the next level. And very often we are finding that this is not the case because we haven't put in enough resources, for example. And so our idea is that it is actually possible to regenerate higher education institutions on this continent, because if you visit them and you speak to the people who work there, you look at the students who attend those institutions, they're bright. They're bright, they're working hard. You have kids who have dreams and visions, and professors and faculty who want to help them to fulfill that. And sometimes they're simply cramped by a lack of resources. And so we were thinking, what is one possible way of helping to restore these institutions to a position where they really are creating the continent's future leadership, people who are capable of taking us to the next level, whatever that may be.
One last question. You just laid out a very ambitious long-term plan for OER and higher education in Africa. What are some of OER Africa's short-term strategies in meeting this vision?
Well, when we started working with institutions, we found that although you always found a champion, somebody who was keen, who was interested in developing resources in a collaborative manner, very often the institutional framework didn't support this person. They didn't recognize the work that this woman or this man had put into creating these new resources. We found that perhaps the creation of open educational resources, as opposed to resources that were peer-reviewed, was not recognized, for example, as a means for promotion. We found that people didn't understand or didn't know about, in more cases than didn't understand, they didn't know about the existence of alternative forms of licensing to the typical copyright licensing, which is very closed. Basically, if you create a work and you license it under a copyright license, you've automatically said that people cannot adapt this work, they cannot use it to teach and learn without paying a fee. And yet there are all of these alternative licensing frameworks. The Creative Commons licensing framework is the most well-known, that allows you to say, okay, I've created this work, I would like somebody else to be able to use it, to adapt it, to change it, to make it relevant to their own students in their own country. So basically, one of the things, a short-term strategy, is working with institutions to ensure that their overarching policy framework is supportive of people working together in a collaborative manner. That's one of the strategies that we're working towards. Another gap that we found is that in terms of sound pedagogy, in terms of sound teaching and learning, higher education systems the world over presume that if you are a subject matter expert, if you have studied macrobiology to postgraduate level, then you can teach it. It's not always the case that this follows. Because I know something, it doesn't necessarily mean that I can tell you about it or I can teach you about it. And so very often people were teaching in a manner that was not necessarily imparting the necessary skills to their students. And so we found that even in the creation of resources, people were acquiring skills that they didn't necessarily have before. When somebody sits down and has to actually think through, what is it that I want my students to get out of this particular course, out of this particular module? Why am I putting it together this way? What should they know by the end of this? It's changing their whole way of thinking about the educational process, because they're having to think through every little step of what they're doing. And so this was another way in which we thought that this would be a good strategy, because in the creation of resources, you're having to think through what it is that you're doing. Once you put those resources out there, and even if out there is just within the institutional framework, it means that students have access to materials that they didn't have access to before, whether those materials are a Word document, a PDF file, a video clip. In Ghana, for example, where, as you know, we're working, we had the example where students were able to watch a video of a hysterectomy before going into class. It made it a completely different teaching experience, both from the perspective of the teachers and the perspective of the students. Suddenly the students didn't need to be fighting for space to see the patient, and how do you cut, and why did you cut like that, and why didn't you angle your knife this way, and what does it mean when this happens, when the womb is extended this way or that way, because they had watched it. So when they came into class, the professors found that students were asking completely different questions from those who had never watched this kind of a video. So it means that students are then empowered to be taking a far more active role in their own learning process than ever before. I think one of the best anecdotal things I heard was when one of the professors said, so I have this material on video, would anybody like a copy? And everybody sort of, the students, sort of muttered amongst themselves, no thanks, no thanks. And the professor knew that meant that they had all made copies a long time ago, which is a great thing. It's empowering students in a way that they were never empowered before. They're not going there thinking that unless this man or this woman tells me something, I have no way of accessing it. So these are the short-term strategies that we're interested in working with.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.